Hello everyone, welcome to this week's Life on the Edge video lesson. I'm filming this today on November 3rd, which as many of you probably know is election day in America. And so I'm filming it in the kind of middle of the day on November 3rd. So I don't know what the results of the election will be. By the time most of you see this, we will likely have at least an idea of what the outcome of this year's election is. And of course, today, as people are voting, every 18-year-old citizen and older throughout the country has the opportunity to make their opinion known and gets to place their vote in order to help steer our country towards life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And because of that, I thought it would be appropriate this week to talk a little bit about freedom, because in order to pursue happiness, in order to have life and liberty and to pursue the happiness that we all desire, it requires freedom. And we've talked a little bit about happiness so far this year. If you might remember, we're talking about morality and social justice. Morality and social justice. Morality is the way in which we take action to love others, and social justice is the way in which our society works together, the way we work with our neighbors to love everyone that we meet. And in order to do any of that, freedom is a necessary part of it, because God gives us freedom. We are given free will as a gift from God. It's necessary for us to be happy, because remember, God created us for a relationship with him. God created us with the intention of us living within eternity with him. And he loves us so greatly that he desires more than anything else for us to be with him and to have a relationship with us. He loves us so much that he's willing to die on a cross to make that possible. But of course, he gives us free will. And that means that we have the ability to choose whether or not we want to have a relationship with God, or if we want to choose things that are against God. Now, why does God give us that free will? Well, it's because he loves us, and freedom is necessary for love. No one can force you to love someone. We cannot be forced to love someone. It has to be a choice. Love is much more than a feeling as well. We might feel love for someone, but that's not true and authentic love. Authentic love requires that we choose to love a person. We choose what is best for them each and every day. And that's hard. But God gives us free will because it's necessary for that loving relationship. If he didn't give us free will, we would just be mindless robots that were required to follow what he told us. And that's not what God wants for us. He wants us to choose him. And so why would we choose him? What would make us want to choose a life with God? Well, if we're created for God, if we're created with that kind of that hardwired in us to desire a relationship with God, anything but a relationship with God won't fulfill us. If we choose something that isn't of God, if we choose something that does not help us grow closer to God, then ultimately that won't fulfill us. It won't fulfill that purpose that we have in our life, and we won't be happy. And I know we've talked about this kind of already, but I want to review it because it's important for today's discussion. Because if we have freedom, then that's ultimately what we're choosing. In every choice we make, we choose between good and evil, right and wrong. And ultimately, we're choosing between God or against God. We're choosing morality or sin. And that's important, because every decision we make has even a small impact on that success in pursuing God to become the saints that God has created us to be. And so we're given the ability to choose God, but when we choose against him, that's what we call sin. When we choose against what God desires for us, that is what we call sin. Just choosing something that goes against God. Now, obviously, many of us, when we think of sin, we might think of, the 10 Commandments. And that works, because the 10 Commandments are kind of the most simple outline of the things that we should choose not to do in order to choose God. So thou shalt not kill, because killing is against God. God is a God of love and life. And so if we choose to kill, we're choosing against him. So we are called to choose life. Thou shalt not steal. God is a God of justice, and justice would require that we earn what we have, and we don't take from others. And so that is a sin. in stealing from others. There's a long list of the 10 Commandments that you guys can talk about in your small groups. But it's important for us to know that those choices, we do have a choice. I think oftentimes when we talk about sin, we often kind of think, well, like we're human, we're inevitably going to sin. And that's kind of true. Ever since our first parents, Adam and Eve, you might remember from the very beginning of time, Adam and Eve were put in the garden with God, and God gave them one rule: to not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And why did God tell them that? Wouldn't it have been just easier if God hadn't put that tree in the garden? Well, again, it's so that they had the ability to choose. If they didn't have the tree in the garden, they wouldn't have been able to choose to turn against God. And so it was important that they had that choice. But unfortunately, they made the wrong choice. Satan convinced them that maybe God wasn't desiring what was best for them, that Satan convinced them to distrust God. And so they chose to eat of the fruit from that tree. And that brought sin into the world. And ever since that, we as people, as every person who has ever existed since then, has what's called concupiscence, or an inclination towards sin. So we're kind of drawn towards that sin. But that's not the end of the story, fortunately, because again, we have a God that loves us. And so God gives us grace to overcome that sin. Grace is a free gift. It's a gift that he gives us every single day. We just have to ask for it. And we get it in incredible ways, especially in the sacraments. That's why God calls us to go to Mass and go to confession, and to be baptized. And so we receive that grace from God to overcome that sin in our lives. We're not stuck with sin. We're not required. We are not stuck choosing against God. There's so much hope for us. And so when we talk about freedom, we have to understand that freedom is not simply just choosing what we want to do. That's a very simple and kind of American understanding of freedom, right? Like when we talk about freedom, when we're talking about America, we often think about it as like, oh, we're choosing whatever we want to do. I'm a warm-blooded patriot. I want to do what I want to do, and I'm American, so no one can stop me. That's not what freedom is really about. Freedom, Pope John Paul II tells us that freedom does not consist in doing whatever we want, but in doing what we should. In other words, John Paul II tells us that freedom does not mean that we just get to choose whatever we want, whatever makes us feel good, or whatever looks out for our best interest. Instead, freedom really consists in doing what is best for everyone, what is best for us, what is best for our neighbor. Ultimately, freedom is in the ability to choose love for another person. And that's important because that is what we're created for. And so we have to make those choices, because ultimately anything but those good choices, those choices that lead us closer to God, if those choices lead us to sin, sin never gives us freedom. Sin always binds us to the problem, and sin always leads to more sin. And so we have to understand that if we desire to become the people we're created to be, we first and foremost have to make the choices that lead us closer to God, even when those choices are hard. And it's also important for us to know that God does not leave us hanging. He is right there with us, walking alongside us, calling us to take those steps. He's giving us all those tools that we need in order to succeed. And so what I want to leave you with is an example of what freedom can really bring about. It's a very simple example, but I like it a lot because I think it really illustrates this. Because I think, again, when we talk about freedom, we think, oh, like if I don't get to choose whatever I want, then that's not free. But this is a very simple example from a few years ago that really illustrates this. And so back, probably about 20 years ago, there was a study done by some psychologists to determine for a school that was building a playground, to determine what was best in the best interest of the school. Because some parents were frustrated that the school wanted to build a fence around the playground. And they thought, some parents thought that if having a fence around the playground would make the kids feel like they were caged, or that they were limited, or they didn't have freedom to play. And so in order to determine what was in the best interest of the school, the psychologists looked at different schools to see which ones had fences, which ones didn't, and they measured how far children would play away from the playground if there was a fence or if there wasn't one. And what they found is that schools with fences around their playground, the children played much farther away from the actual playground equipment because they felt more comfortable. They felt safe. And it works much the same way with the rules and the morality that God gives us. When God gives us rules, he gives us those 10 commandments. He leads us in our morality and leads us closer to him by giving us those rules, not to restrict our freedom, but so that we know where the boundaries are in pursuing who we're created to be, and so that we can confidently and safely live our life in its fullness and know exactly the choices that we should make so that we can pursue an abundant life without fear of falling into sin. And so God gives us those rules. God gives us the ability to navigate life towards a relationship with him for our good. So I want you to leave today knowing that you have freedom. You have the ability to choose a relationship with God, and God desires nothing more than that relationship with you. And all of these rules, as the year goes on and we continue to talk about morality and social justice, we're going to talk about what some of those rules that God gives us look like and why we have them. And I want you to leave today knowing that those rules are not to restrict you, but to give you freedom. Amen. Thank you for joining me today. Have a wonderful rest of your time in small group, and I will see you very soon.